Welcome back for the third episode of my submission for the 2022 Great Guitar Build-Off. In this installment, I'm going to cover one of the most unique elements of this build, which is the fretboard. For this guitar, I chose to do a multi-scale design, with the bass end being 26 inches and with the treble end being 24.5 inches. That seems to be a fairly standard layout based on the research that I did, and it offers a nice visual fan of the frets. Interestingly, I've never actually played a multi-scale guitar before, so when I play this one for the first time, that will be my intro into the multi-scale world. The fretboard blank here is wangy, but I took a tip from the electric luthier and actually spray painted the fretboard white just to make things a little bit easier to see in terms of the pencil marks. Typically I use the fret template from StewMac, so it's a machined steel template with the notches that you either use with a miter saw or a table saw. However, that's not viable for the multi-scale, so I'm doing the fret slots here completely by hand and with measurements from an online tool calculator. The one that I use is called ekips.org, and I was introduced to that site through the multi-scale video done by IP Guitars. Essentially, the site allows you to enter your scale length for the bass and the treble strings, as well as where you want your parallel fret to be, and then it calculates the individual distances for each fret from the nut on each string, as well as the distances between the frets on each string. So I found that to be an excellent tool. Definitely check that out if you're planning on doing a fretboard like this. As you can see, once I got the center line on the fretboard blank, as well as the outline of the upper part of the neck, and the nut, and the headstock, I taped a steel ruler to the fingerboard, and I definitely recommend getting one of these if you're planning to try to mark and cut the frets yourself, and definitely one that has millimeters, because it's just a lot easier to deal with that than inches. Essentially, I just used the calculator to find the distances, and then carefully marked each fret location based on the millimeters in the calculation on the low E string. And then from there, I just repeated the process down the high E string as well. The important thing to note here, though, is that once you have the low E string done, you then need to find your parallel fret, or wherever the hypothetical parallel line would be, so it doesn't have to be a fret, and use that as your reference line for the starting point on the high E string. So in other words, that's the reference point you'd use in relation to the low E. For me, that's the 9th fret, so I needed to check the calculator first for the millimeter measurement for the 9th fret, and then tape the ruler based on that specific mark. And then in turn, that allowed me to find the exact point for the nut on the high E string, and I could kind of proceed through the normal distancing from there. Once I had all the frets marked for the two strings, I took a scalpel and also my StewMac straight edge and scored the fret slot by lining up the two marks. And from there, I just took that approach all the way up the fretboard. And when doing this, I definitely found that it was best to take multiple lighter passes as opposed to trying to do it all in one shot. I think that just helps to avoid just any risk of the scalpel slipping and potentially scratching up the fretboard. After that, the key is to open up the slot with a larger blade. So I used a sharp utility knife just to go back over the slots one more time. Essentially, this just makes it a lot easier to eventually get a good grip with the blade once we transition over to either a razor saw or a Japanese saw. From there, I went ahead and trimmed the fretboard to length over on the miter saw, along with establishing the angle on each end of the fretboard. And then lastly, I went to work on doing my fret markers. For this build, I wanted to try doing some rectangular inlays in the middle of the frets, and I wanted the fret markers to have an angle that followed the design and the flow of the multi-scale frets. So in other words, the fret markers themselves needed to also be angled. This is a little bit challenging to figure out, but I figured that using the table saw and tilting the blade would be the best option for that. And essentially I used a protractor to mark the angles of the two frets that were being split in half, and then just took the difference between the two angles to calculate the correct angle for the fret marker, and then just put the table saw blade at that angle. Also for this step, I made a separate crosscut sled for the table saw, as you can see here, and I also used a sacrificial piece against the fence to help align with each cut. Each one of these fret markers did take quite a bit of time, but ultimately they turned out really well. It was quite a challenge to just get everything to line up exactly correctly and have the blade height exactly the right height, but ultimately it worked out. Ended up using maple for the fret markers as well as bloodwood, so I'm excited for you guys to see that in the next video. If you enjoyed this one, definitely consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Also, if you're participating in the Great Guitar Build-Off yourself, I'm looking forward to checking out your videos. So overall, I'm looking forward to seeing you guys in the next one.